Welcome to Bible Fiber, where we are encountering the textures and shades of the biblical tapestry through 12 minor prophets, 2 reformers, and 1 exile. I am Shelley Neese, president of the Jerusalem Connection, a Christian organization devoted to sharing the story of the people of Israel, both ancient and modern. This week we are studying Ezekiel 20. Through parables, fables, laments, allegories, and riddles, the prophet spent the previous 5 chapters undermining the exiles' ingratitude and blame shifting. However, Ezekiel must have grown tired of delivering opaque messages. In chapter 20, Ezekiel broke from a long streak of metaphorical language and finally delivered a straightforward history lesson. By recasting their history from the divine viewpoint, Ezekiel's historical overview contrasts Israel's chronic rebellion with God's persistent mercy. In August 591 BCE, 2 years after Ezekiel's commissioning by the river Chebar and 11 months after his Jerusalem vision, a contingent of elders paid Ezekiel a visit. Perhaps they were the same elders who had earlier approached Ezekiel. In that instance, the prophet accused the elders of secretly worshiping idols in their hearts. The chapter does not identify the new delegation's inquiry or explain their motivation for seeking prophetic counsel. Either way, the audacity of seeking an oracle incensed Yahweh. He declared, "I will not be consulted by you." Rather than sending them away, God put the elders in the hot seat, instructing Ezekiel to let them know the abominations of their ancestors. In a lengthy divine speech, Ezekiel selectively divided Israel's history into 4 periods: the generation in Egypt, 2 generations in the wilderness, the generation after the conquest, and the exiled generation. In his selective historical recap, Ezekiel departed from Israel's traditional narrative. Although the foundational stories of Abraham's election, the Israelites' deliverance out of Egypt, their preservation in the wilderness, and the miracle of the conquest were all true, Ezekiel found them to be unhelpful confidence boosters. He skewed his historic retelling to show the deep roots of their apostasy and the continuation of faithlessness throughout the generations. Ezekiel's historical arc skips the patriarchal period and jumps right to the Exodus. God chose Israel and made himself known to the house of Jacob while they were slaves in Egypt. In his grace, he swore to them he would rescue them from Egypt and bring them to the land tenderly described as flowing with milk and honey, the most glorious of all the lands. Throughout the passage, Ezekiel explains how God took every initiative in establishing the covenant relationship. His only requirement was that before delivering them to the promised land, they must cast out their detestable idols from Egypt. The Egypt generation possessed the Abrahamic covenant, but had not yet received the Mosaic law. God did not hold them accountable to the laws and decrees given at Sinai. However, at the very least, the Abrahamic covenant required exclusive devotion to the one true God. According to Ezekiel, they failed the loyalty test. The book of Exodus never describes the spiritual condition or religious practices of the Israelites while they were in Egypt. Ezekiel's oracle fills in a historical gap, perhaps based on an oral history not documented in the Torah tradition. According to Ezekiel, the Israelites' idolatry problem traced back to their time in Egypt. The colorful Egyptian pantheon was apparently too tempting for the Israelites to resist during their 4-century sojourn. The Exodus tradition portrays an epic showdown between Yahweh and Pharaoh, in which the Israelites find themselves caught in the middle. According to Ezekiel's analysis, God supernaturally delivered a series of afflictions to teach the Egyptians a lesson about his power over Egyptian deities, and to display his supremacy to the wayward Israelites. Each plague directly challenged a specific Egyptian deity. For example, turning the Nile River into blood proved his superiority over Hapi, the Egyptian god of the Nile. After Yahweh defeated Pharaoh and his gods by proxy, he appealed to the freed Israelites to put aside their idols and follow him. Ezekiel recounts not one of them cast away the detestable things on which their eyes feasted, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. Ezekiel's revelation about Israelite idol worship in Egypt provides extra context for the golden calf episode at Mount Sinai. According to Exodus 32, the Israelites grew anxious after Moses' prolonged absence at the top of Mount Sinai. They demanded that Aaron make them a golden calf so they would have a visible deity to worship. Aaron way too easily complied, fashioning the calf out of their gold jewelry. The Israelites then worshiped the calf, attributing their deliverance from Egypt to the manufactured calf rather than Yahweh. The episode was a slap in the face for God. In the Exodus telling, the golden calf episode seems to come out of nowhere, as if their abomination stemmed only from impatience. According to Ezekiel's revisionist history, the Israelites reverted to idol worship at Mount Sinai because they had been loyal to the Egyptian pantheon for centuries. After the golden calf incident, Yahweh threatened to wipe the Israelites out and start fresh with a new nation. To Ezekiel, Yahweh recalls, "I thought I would pour out my wrath upon them and spend my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. But I acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations." The passage is referencing the moment in Exodus that Moses pleaded with God to cancel his punishment. Moses' line of reason was not that the Israelites deserved to be spared. He asked God to preserve Israel in the interest of his own reputation among the nations. What would the Egyptians say if God delivered the Israelites out of Egypt only to destroy them in the wilderness? Moses' point was effective enough, so God relented. After the events at Sinai, God watched over the Israelites during the wilderness years, dwelling among them, forming and shaping them into a nation. The greatest gift he gave the generation in Egypt was freedom. The greatest gift he gave the wilderness generation was his covenant. By God's design, Jews are supposed to perceive the Mosaic laws as divine guidance for seeking holiness, living ethically, and maintaining their bond with God and each other. Yahweh intended what he gave them at Sinai to be a source of spiritual nourishment, not a burden. To the wilderness generation, the memory of God's meeting with Moses on Mount Sinai should have been fresh. As they had waited at the base of the mountain, they witnessed thunder and lightning and a thick cloud resting on the mountaintop. They felt the earth tremble and heard the voice of God. After witnessing such supernatural events, Yahweh rightly expected total obedience. Instead, the wilderness generation was the first to receive God's laws and the first to disregard his laws. Yahweh explained to Ezekiel, "The house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not observe my statutes, but rejected my ordinances, by whose observance everyone shall live, and my Sabbaths they greatly profaned." The Sabbath was one of Yahweh's highest order commands. Yahweh gave the Sabbath to all humanity since the time of Adam, but it was a special sign of the covenant people's sanctification. According to Ezekiel, the Israelites desecrated the Sabbaths, even in the wilderness when God provided all their needs. Once again, Ezekiel seems to know an oral history left unrecorded in the Torah. In the Torah tradition, there's only one instance of Israel breaking the Sabbath during the wilderness wandering. When the community caught a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath, they followed the leadership of Moses and Aaron and stoned him to death. From that story, Numbers gives the impression that the Israelites took Sabbath observance seriously. Ezekiel claims otherwise. By cataloging Israel's many sins during their wilderness wanderings, Ezekiel broke from the prophetic tradition that idealized this period. Prophets like Hosea, Amos, and Jeremiah used the wilderness years as a symbolic reference to call the nation back to a purer, more faithful relationship with God. They characterized the wilderness period as a time of intimacy and devotion because the nation relied on Yahweh for food and shelter. Hosea longed for Israel to return to the days of her youth, and Jeremiah described the wilderness period as the honeymoon of the covenant relationship. In contrast, Ezekiel's historical reflection is anything but a romantic rehash of foundational lore. Like an ancient version of Malcolm Gladwell, Ezekiel used revisionist history to rock the boat. By omitting the patriarchs, godly judges, and obedient kings, he made a point about the bigger problem of nagging idolatry and persistent disloyalty. Ezekiel showed they were worse than they realized and always had been. Nonetheless, God was more patient and merciful than they had ever given him credit. By God's good grace, he did not annihilate the nation and start over. However, he allowed them to incur the consequences of their rebellion. Yahweh told Ezekiel, "My eyes spared them, and I did not destroy them or make an end of them in the wilderness." God withheld his punishing hand for the sake of his own name and his reputation among the nations. After the first wilderness generation, Ezekiel exposited the history of their children in the wilderness, a reference to the second wilderness generation. God's mood grew more frustrated with each successive generation. He repeated the same imperative: "Follow my statutes, be careful to observe my ordinances, and hallow my Sabbaths, that they may be a sign between me and you, so that you may know that I, the Lord, am your God." 5 times, Ezekiel singled out Sabbath observance as one of the most critical commandments. Each time he referenced the Sabbaths as in a plural Sabbath, meaning he had more than the seventh day in mind. Sabbaths included the weekly Sabbath, sabbatical year, and the Jubilee year. According to Ezekiel, the Israelites had defiled them all. Breaking the Sabbath for an Israelite was equivalent to rejecting his gift and denying the uniqueness of their relationship with the Creator God. According to God's promise, if they observed the Sabbath, they would grow in reliance on their Creator. Jewish tradition often personifies the Sabbath as a bride or queen. On Friday evening Sabbath services, congregants recite the 16th century liturgical poem, Lecha Dodi. The poem means, "Come, my beloved," as it invites the Jewish people to greet the Sabbath as a beautiful bride. The congregation often stands and turns to the door during the last stanza in order to symbolically greet the Sabbath. According to such romantic imagery, if Israel disregards the Sabbath, the nation has essentially stood Yahweh up on the altar. In Ezekiel's historical account, God prohibited the wilderness generation from entering Canaan because they were neglectful of his laws and they broke the Sabbaths. If the people lived in a state of rebellion, God could not allow them to take possession of the covenant land. Ezekiel's analysis differs slightly from the Torah tradition. According to the book of Numbers, the first wilderness generation lost their privilege of entering the promised land because they lacked faith. Moses sent 12 spies, one from each tribe, to explore Canaan and report back on the land and its inhabitants. After 40 days, the spies returned with their findings. They confirmed that the land was fertile and desirable, but the current occupants were strong and lived in fortified settlements. Fear and despair overtook the Israelite encampment. Because of their lack of faith, God vowed that the current generation would not take possession of the promised land. Frustrated by the second wilderness generation's inability to reform, God recounted to Ezekiel, "I swore to them in the wilderness that I would scatter them among the nations and disperse them through the countries." No other biblical narrative claims Yahweh told his people, even while they were still in the wilderness, that he would disperse them if they continued to sin. Ezekiel's mini history lesson undermined any delusions about Israel's glorious past. Before the Israelites ever even took possession of the land, God foresaw that one day he would kick them out again. Chapter 20 contains a contentious verse that seems to suggest that God set the people up for failure with flawed laws. Ezekiel states, "Moreover, I gave them statutes that were not good and ordinances by which they could not live." However, it's implausible that Ezekiel meant the Mosaic laws were faulty, given that his entire book emphasizes obedience to God's laws. Ezekiel's rhetoric often tends towards the extreme, and here he builds a case that because of the people's persistent corruption, God allowed them to pursue their own destructive paths, forsaking his graciously given laws for bad ones. The most egregious example of their distortion of divine commands was the practice of child sacrifice, which they falsely believed God demanded as a sign of devotion. Ezekiel shares a theology similar to Paul in Romans 1. Persistent disobedience can drive such a wedge between God and his creation that God gives humans over in their desires of their hearts and allows them to exchange the truth about God for a lie. According to both Ezekiel and Paul, once the covenant people have turned their faces away from him, God allows people to follow their desires to their own destructive ends. In Ezekiel, the Israelites defiled themselves through idol worship and covenant breaking. In Romans, Paul describes humanity as worshiping creation instead of the Creator. Ezekiel's tone becomes increasingly bitter as he recounts the history of the settled generation. Despite being gifted with the promised land by God, they misused the land to further their treachery. Just as they had adopted idolatrous practices in Egypt, they did the same in Canaan, dedicating every high hill and leafy tree to false gods made of wood and stone. Their persistent temptation was to conform to the practices of the surrounding nations, despite their call to be distinct. Considering Ezekiel's earlier emphasis on personal responsibility in chapter 18, it seems contradictory to implicate the exiled generation of the sins of their ancestors. However, Ezekiel's accusations portray his compatriots in Tel Aviv as part of an unbroken cycle of rebellion. They bore the same guilt as their ancestors because they committed the same sins. Ezekiel brought the offenses of the past forward, stating, "You defile yourselves with all your idols to this day." Each generation added another layer of bricks to the wall they had built between themselves and Yahweh. Ezekiel organized his historic retellings according to a cycle of God's kindness met by rebellion, which provoked divine discipline. Whether in Egypt, the wilderness, Canaan, or exile, every generation failed to follow Yahweh. For the first 3 generations, he withheld the full force of his punishing hand to protect his own name. To those in Babylonian exile, Ezekiel taught that their judgment was both deserved and long overdue. Exile was not Yahweh's last act. Taking the initiative, God promised he would repeat all his mighty acts of the past. Only this time, he would purge and purify a remnant along the way. By bringing back the dispersed exiles, he would launch a new exodus, leading them out of captivity and into the wilderness. God promised, "I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you out of the countries where you are scattered with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm." God portrayed his coming intervention as the new exodus, intentionally using phraseology from the first Exodus account, like mighty hand and outstretched arm. During their new period of wilderness wandering, God said, "I will enter into judgment with you face to face." During the first Exodus, God only spoke with Moses face to face. In this rendition of the Exodus and wilderness wandering, God will not need a mediator like Moses. Instead, he will directly encounter his people. Ezekiel did not designate a specific wilderness where he would bring the exiles. Most likely, the wilderness was a general symbol, as a place of purging where God would separate the righteous from the rebels. God described the sifting process as a shepherd taking inventory of his sheep. "I will make you pass under the staff and will bring you within the bond of the covenant." The staff was a shepherd's instrument of correction. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus mirrored Ezekiel's image of the ingathering and judgment by also using shepherd language. Jesus said, "All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats." Ezekiel's message of hope was only good news for those who repented and reformed. For them, the wilderness would be a place of purification. Free of distractions and the temptation of assimilation, they could devote themselves to Yahweh once more. In return, God would ratify a new covenant and reign as king over the purified people. All those who preferred to keep their idols rather than worship and obey Yahweh would remain in the wilderness and not take part in the new Exodus. Ezekiel prophesied, "I will purge out the rebels among you and those who transgress against me. I will bring them out of the land where they reside as aliens, but they shall not enter the land of Israel." The remnant's return to the covenant land would firmly establish God's rule and reign. God emphasized that the physical land of Israel played a crucial role in his plan for the new age of mercy. Only once they retook the land would they fully recognize and worship Yahweh. Only in Jerusalem would he accept their offerings. Ezekiel pronounced, "For on my holy mountain, the mountain height of Israel, says the Lord God, there are all the house of Israel, all of them shall serve me in the land. There I will accept them." God's ultimate plan included universal recognition of his sovereignty and his name. When he restored the remnant, the nations would take note. God said, "I will manifest my holiness among you in the sight of the nations." Despite centuries of sin and rebellion, Ezekiel's good news is that nothing can stop God's restoration plan. His grace will prevail. Thank you for listening, and please continue to take part in this Bible reading challenge. Join us next week in studying the rest of Ezekiel 20 and chapter 21. Also, one more thing, if you like Bible Fiber and it's been helpful to you in your own journey of biblical literacy, please leave a review for the podcast on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you listen. It helps others find the show. And please keep the nation of Israel and the hostages in your prayers. Israelis are living a nightmare scenario now, not knowing if or when Iran might attack. For all the biblical references each week, please see the show transcript on our blog or by signing up for our emails at thejerusalemconnection.us. I don't say all the references in the podcast, but they're all in the transcript. Send me a message, I'll respond. Bible Fiber is available on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Am Israel Chai.